welcome everyone. As Kyle mentioned, I'm Paul Spears, developer here at Oasis Digital, one of the Angular Bootcamp instructors. Again, as Kyle mentioned, I'm going to be talking about SmartView pattern in Angular, technically Angular 2 Plus. This works with anything 2 and beyond what we're going to be talking about. I like to always kind of get a feel of the room, see who here is actually actively using Angular 2 Plus or anything previous. So a quick show of hands, who here is using Angular 2 or later in everyday kind of work? Okay, awesome. I think it might be the first time we have a majority, or at least half. We're getting close. Angular 1 still? Awesome. And so I'll kind of give me a feel. What I'm talking about can technically be done in Angular 1. It would be a little bit more laborious and just probably not as useful in Angular 1, but this can apply there. But it's mostly aimed at Angular 2 Plus. Okay, so that's me. So let's put a subtitle on this of putting the MVC back into Angular. And the reason I did that was if you looked at Angular 1, really well-crafted Angular 1 applications, and even the branding of Angular 1, they even say it's a super heroic MVC framework. And if you look at these well-crafted examples of Angular 1 code, if you squint just right, you can kind of see an MVC-like pattern emerge from the applications. And as Angular continued its development cycle and moved on to 2 Plus and its versioning, that pattern started to get lost a little bit in the noise of all the features and design patterns and TypeScript, and all of that together ended up kind of fading into the background. And so I like to pull that back out and see it a little bit more. Let's see. So why do we care about it being an MVC pattern that we choose to use? Well, I like my separation of concerns high and my coupling loose in my code. And generally speaking, if you're following an MVC pattern, you're on the right path to being able to create code like that a little more easily. And so generally speaking, if you've got an MVC pattern, you can follow that, and you're going to be in a good spot to keep that separation of concern high, especially the separation of concern with this particular pattern. Okay, so to start off, we're going to take a look at a basic component example. This is actually lifted straight from the Tour of Heroes off of the Angular docs. This is probably the first component that most beginning Angular developers will actually see. It's the very first one that they actually list the full code in all of its glory. There's actually not much more below here on the screen. It is the rest of the class definition being the rest of the inline object definition. Most of it, though, is actually the template itself. So in this particular example, we see a coupling of the view, the model definition, and how the model is updated and interacted with, all within one file. So if you're talking MVC, all of those pieces are technically represented right here, all mangled up within one another. Now, the Tour of Heroes correctly goes on to actually separate out the model, the definition of a hero, and how to get one from the component, but that's as far as they go. They leave the fact that this input is actually also responsible for manipulating that model. So in the MVC pattern, you can think of this one little line as the only controller code in here. It's when a user changes this, how do I actually capture that change and have it reflected in the application? And so in this super tiny example, this would be the only thing that we could even kind of consider a controller. Even though we have a component class right below it, it doesn't actually do anything. So in this one tiny little example, one of the first ones you'll see, it kind of already moved well away from an MVC-like pattern by cobbling up all of these concerns. So let's talk about how this would compare to a SmartView component and what SmartView components are. So we would take a classic component, like the one we just saw, and we would divide it into two separate components. We would make one component concerned about just the view. Given some data, how do I present the data? The other component would be about, I need to capture several sources of data in many different ways, bind them together, and possibly prepare them for some sort of output. Likewise, it would also say, I also want to be able to accept input from a view layer and know how to store that back to the rest of the system. So that's the idea behind adding two components in the place of one, is that you're separating out the view logic from your actual controller logic. Okay? So with this, to achieve that, we're going to say our smart component is going to gather up our data and bind it down using the template binding syntax into the view component. And the view component is going to capture user action and re-emit those as events. It's going to have zero concern about what to actually do with the data. Simply going to pass it back up to the smart component itself. So back to naming, Kyle mentioned earlier, there's other names for this. The smart dumb pattern was kind of the first one. People have rapidly started to realize it's kind of a derisive name. Let's come up with something else. And from that, the kind of two leading ones are SmartView and then Smart Presentation. So you might have heard of this as the Smart Presentation Component pattern. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and look at some code. Okay, so this code is actually code that's going to be reviewed as a change for our Angular Bootcamp material. So just kind of ignores some of the cruft and fluff around the example itself. But at the heart of this, the actual example app looks like this. So pieces that we don't really care about the code of, we have a navigation bar that's actually going to let me switch between several examples of the exact same feature, but the code behind it is going to be different for each one. We'll take a look at how we can actually craft the same functionality with a couple different ideas of how we might approach the MVC issue. So the actual application consists of a list of employees. Clicking on one then takes you to that employee's details. Okay. Image, credits go out to Phil Murray. It's an image placeholder site all about Phil Murray pictures. And then again, example 2, same exact functionality in all three. So let's take a look at the code behind this. So each one of those routes points to employee list 1, 2, or 3. Employee list 1, we're just going to dive straight into the detail. We're going to skip the list. We're going to go straight into the detail version of this. And this is our TS file, and we've moved now several layers of abstraction away from that tour of heroes like example into something that's much more realistic in terms of the kind of data that you're going to be looking at in an application. Now we actually have our data coming in as an observable, which is almost universally true. If you're writing an Angular 2 application, you're going to have to deal with observables at some point. And so here we actually have an employee observable. And that is what we actually store on the class itself. We also get that employee by observing our route, which then encodes the selected employee's ID, capture that ID, and then we utilize that to then get the details for an employee. So this is kind of a fairly standard kind of approach where you land on a component. That component needs to figure out what it should display. It goes out, makes that request, and then captures that data. And it comes back as an observable. So here I've stashed that observable on the component, and now I'm able to bind to that in the template. So here's where things get ugly. Now, this is just one example of how we might take that data and bind it to the screen. Here we're actually saying, you know what, I don't even want to show, all of this is just CSS filler to make my card look nice and pretty. And then here we actually have the first bit of functionality. We're saying, hey, take a look at that employee observable. The async pipe says, wait for the data to actually be available and extract out the most recent data. So we're saying, if there's something here, something that we can actually look at, then go ahead and show the content of that card. Then it goes on to say, oh, I need to bind to the name. Well, to do that, I need my curly braces. But then I need to take my employee, unpack it, make sure it's something that actually is traversable, and then grab the first name property off of it. And then I use that exact same pattern every single time I want to refer to a property on the employee. This is less than ideal. It couples a couple of things together. First, you have to now care about the observableness of your data source, and you have to handle that in a rather verbose way here, by knowing that you have to pipe it through async, make sure that's something that you could traverse against, and then get that data out. So this is one way to handle it. There's actually syntax that's been proposed for version 4, or is in version 4, the else syntax. Is that still
in the 4 beta? You can use it right now with the beta. A number of us are hoping that a cleaner syntax arrives later.
And so this is kind of what's floating out there now. If I can activate it here. That did not help. There we go. So this is another way to do it, but it kind of has its own set of problems. Here they are saying, okay, ngIf, take our employee, pipe it to async. If there's nothing there, then show this template labeled as loading. Otherwise, capture the value under the name employee, and then you can just start binding to it like normal. Probably an improvement over what I've just shown, still not all that great. It still has your designer scratching their head trying to figure out what in the world they're supposed to even style. Okay? So let's take a look at another approach to this. Exact same functionality with a slightly different approach. Here we go. All right, now in our constructor for our detail component, we're still observing the route parameters and using those to get the details. But now we actually perform a manual subscription inside the component. And we do that way we can actually capture the value and stash it on the component itself. But in order to do that, we actually have to maintain a reference to the subscription. Question, yes?
I'm curious how many people do it this way in their code that they really write in a room. Like, who does it this way? Who does this? Anybody?
Or the previous way. Okay, if you're not doing this and you're not doing the previous way, what in the world are you doing?
I've made a separate component that I do the async pipe, and then I pass it to a purely view component.
So you're using SmartView.
Okay. He was personally taught by us.
Right. Yeah. He had.
Well, it came up though when I first saw the first one. I'm like, this is painful. There's got to be a better way.
Right.
That's right.
Right. So okay, some confusion about what we would have done in these situations, but the idea still stands that if we have observable data, then we got to unpack that. So that's what we're doing here. We're unpacking that, and we're making a subscription to perform that unpacking. But you actually have to capture these subscriptions, because if you don't take care of them, they will actually leak as your components are created and destroyed. And so to do that, we actually have to add a new property to this class. And then we have to set up a new event handler, a new lifecycle hook on destroy, which knows that when this component is destroyed, go ahead and perform this behavior. And then so now we take that subscription and we unsubscribe when we're done. So the template, though, is really nice. It's exactly what you would want. We can just say, hey, make sure there's an employee. And when there is an employee, just start showing me the properties of that employee. That's exactly what we'd hope to have. However, we've now cluttered up our component code with a bunch of logic about needing to understand, I'm maintaining this list of observables, and I got to unpack them, and I got to store the data the right way, and then I got to manually clean up after myself. Again, not ideal. So let's take a look at the third approach now, where we put SmartView in place. So first, take a quick look at the file tree. Now, instead of having just the employee detail, we have employee detail and employee display. As far as naming these is concerned, from scratch, personally, I would have probably made it employee detail and employee detail view.html.ts. I'm kind of working within the confines of some curriculum that I started with, so I didn't get all the way there yet. Naming-wise, though, I've not even seen consensus within our own team about how to name that, so kind of keep a loose opinion on those names. But if we look at the detail, this is what we had before, this is what we have now in the SmartView. Our component is back to the simple version, no lifecycle hooks. It simply says, give me the data, store it as an observable. Okay, so our template for the detail, it has changed drastically. In fact, I'm going to clean up a little bit here to make it easier to read. it now actually calls out to a different component. It calls out to the view component. In this case, the selector for that employee display view is employee display 3, because we're on the third example. We have the binding that says, set the employee based on whatever was in that observable. We're async piping that data into our component. So at this point, we're actually doing the unpacking. That means the view component, the only thing it will ever have, the only thing it'll ever be aware of, is a single input that captures the employee as a raw value, as in this case, an object. So let's take a look now to the new files that we had to add to support this. So here's the display TS file. Super, super clean and simple. We've added an input reference. That way we can say our employee will come in as an input. Nothing else to it. Now our employee is or is not there, end of story. Nothing else to do. Now if we look at the template for it, because it's already an object, we can go straight to referring to it without needing to unpack it. Now in this tiny little example, it's kind of hard to see, all right, so you've got 4 files, each file is really clean, but you now have 4 files. And that's kind of a hard sell with such a small example. So let's take a minute and we're going to go look at one more example of where we might use this. And we're going to take a look at now emitting events back up, and then we'll kind of go into a few more justifications at scale. Okay, so I'm actually going to go back to employee list 1. And now we're actually going to take a look at the list component itself. In all of these examples, it was using a classic pattern. And we're now going to attempt to live code a transition from this classic pattern to a SmartView pair. So the employee list itself starts off using the kind of the simple naive approach that we talked about in approach 1 for the detail as well. We've got an observable to a list of employees, and we just stash that on the component, and then we let the template handle unpacking that. Well, in example 1, if we go back to the running app, I also have a deactivate all button. When you click this button, it sets all employees as inactive. So let's take a look at how we capture that. In our template, here in our ng4, we're unpacking the list of employees with the async pipe, capturing each one individually with the for syntax and displaying its information. That's great. Our button itself has a click handler on it that says Deactivate Employees. Hit something. Okay, and then here we have Deactivate Employees, which calls up to the employee service and says, hey, deactivate all my employees. But meanwhile, our list, because it's an observable that was sourced from that employee service, it'll just send down that update, and our template will continue to unpack it for us automatically. So that's a pretty nice pattern. We'd like to keep this. There's not much to it. If you were here for or had watched Kyle's talk on state management, you'd kind of get an idea as to how you might manage to get this portion of your component so clean and simple with a nice state management system in place. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about from this point down. Okay, so let's go ahead and try and split these apart. So when you're refactoring to try and add a SmartView component, you generally want to leave your starting component alone. Odds are it's doing the right thing or close to the right thing as far as the component class goes. And then the template you're going to want to move to a new file. So let's just do that. Let's make our 2 new files. We're going to have an employee list view.ts and an employee list view.html file. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to capture my existing template. I'm going to wholesale take it, cut it, put it in my view file. Now in my list, we're going to look at what values that we were putting on the template before. We're now going to pass those down into our new component. So I need to get a list into the list view. So my template's now going to be something along the lines of employee list view. And we're going to need to add some bindings. So we're going to add a list binding. We're going to set that equal to the list observable pipe to async. Simple enough transition. So now we need to actually make our list view TS file. But for the sake of making this short and simple, I'm going to copy all the boilerplate from my existing component and then strip it all down. We're not going to have an observable anymore. We're not going to have an employee service anymore. We now have our selector is an employee list view. And then our template is employee list view.html. This is the employee list view component. Our list is actually going to come in as an input. So we need to mark it as such. It's no longer an observable, so I'm going to get rid of the Hungarian notation there, as well as the type. Whoa. Our constructor actually doesn't even do anything anymore. Now what about this deactivate employees? How do we handle this? Well, now at this point I'm going to pause. I'm going to go back to my view and do a little bit of cleanup. And I'm going to do that by way of saying I'm no longer unpacking an observable, I just have a list. Next step is to look at, okay, my click calls deactivate employees. So I'm still going to need a deactivate employees function. However, it's not going to talk to the service directly. That would be a violation of the SmartView pattern, because now you've coupled your view component with the business logic needed to make the appropriate call out. So instead, we're going to replace that with an output. So we need to set up such an output. And I'm going to call this the, let's call it the list change. It's going to be an event emitter of type, technically it's going to be void because it doesn't send up any data. It just says, hey, I've done something. And I'm actually going to set that equal to a new one of those. So I'm instantiating it as part of instantiating my component. So that way whenever a change occurs, I can actually just perform the right thing. List change dot emit the fact that the list changed. Okay, and now to use an event emitter, I'm going to need to bring that in as well. Okay, so now looking at this TS file, there is zero business logic. It's all about shuttling data from some source into a template, collecting events from a template and sending them back up somewhere else, anywhere else. And that's kind of the point, is that it could be anywhere else. Okay, so we got one more change to make, and that is to capture that event. So here, we're going to say when the list change event is fired, I'm going to deactivate all. And so now here I change this to deactivate all. All right. I lied. There's actually one more change we need, and that is to add this component to our module.
You also have a typo on your template.
Really hoping for a first time go there. All right. So, and right now you're actually seeing some of the downsides of this approach, and we're going to look at the pros and cons in more depth in just a minute. So this will be the employee list list view component. And then register that component in my list of declarations. And then you said I have a typo. Okay, in a template. Which template?
There. The closed brace for the employee list view. The greater than sign is on line 2. It needs to be on line 3.
Okay, so let's see what happens here. Uh-oh. Developer tools here, 1 1 second. Helps if I clean up this straight bit right here. Still no dice. Oh, there it goes. Awesome. So there you have it. That was the translation from one to the other. So let's talk for a minute about when and where and how you should be using all this, when it's going to pay off, and just how to best utilize this. So let's go back now to the slides for a second. All right, so benefits of SmartView. Again, a real hard sell with simple components. Let's kind of talk through these points. It's extremely high separation of concern. You've now literally said I'm going to take half of what people usually put inside a component and make an entire different component for that. Concerned solely with, I've been provided data. Is there any specific formatting I need to do to that data to get it on the screen and then do so? I'm capturing user events. Is there any kind of massaging I need to adhere to and match the API I've exposed to anyone that wants to consume me as a component, and then do so, emit just the event in that slightly formatted way. And then you have the other component that says, what do I want to do with all of this information? Where do I get all of this information? How do I obtain it? And it doesn't care at all about how it's displayed. It just passes that data on to the concerned party. This results in extremely clean component templates that are very easy to design around, as opposed to throwing all the logic about unpacking an observable or caring about the fact that you've now embedded the possibly embedded logic into your template about, display this, but you need to then ask about, is this particular thing, activated, and that needs to know about some other service. If you're strictly adhering to this pattern, you're actually going to find that, to do this, I actually need to get my data story right to achieve this pattern. I need my data to actually encode information like, is this particular item selected prior to its arrival in the component? As a result of that, you actually end up with this particular item right here, automatic compatibility with onPush. So onPush is a performance enhancement that you can use if you have your component set up to be able to utilize it. It's the idea that we're going to completely shut down change detection for a particular subtree of my application unless data flows across to one of those input bindings. And that's the only time it would need to do change detection, because that is its only true source of data. Without a change in that, there is nothing to change detect, nothing to run, no template change calculations to make. So that cuts out all of that change detection from running unless you actually need it. That also then makes it so that you're more likely to adhere to a well thought out state management system. I promised I would give this talk on the tail end of Kyle's for this reason, is that when you're using these ideas together, it really, really shines. We also saw the clean component classes themselves. So when you do this, again, your inputs, your outputs are all you have in one, and you have nothing but data sourcing and event handling in the other. There's no concern mixed in with the view logic. It's actually really, really easy to refactor functionality when you have an application at scale if you've been using the SmartView pattern. If you'd like to take an input and move it from one place to the other, because your concerns are so well defined, you're able to know, okay, well, here's the view related to this. I'm just going to pick it up and move it. My data is going to come in through that input. I know exactly what type it's going to be. And then when I get to the smart component, I say, okay, where's the data? Give me the data, pick that up, move that to the corresponding new location. Consistency. I've shown 3 different ways and actually used them interchangeably in one sample little feature. If you have a large number of people working, they might have different opinions about, I think on this case I'm going to actually handle the async pipe in the template. And the next employee is going to come by and say, you know what, I want to unpack that and store the data on the component. And then they're going to work on each other's code and either change it or not quite understand why they did it. It's going to have conversations around that. If you're in a huge corporate environment, meetings are going to be scheduled, time's lost, you may as well give up. If you settle on this, there's a much less lesser chance of that kind of discussion. because those separations are lined out for you. If you've subscribed to something in your component, then you've already broken the rules. Another one is template reuse. So when you've done this, your view component is automatically a reusable component. You can then take the idea that we just had of the employee details and turn that into an entity details. Anything that has an email address, a name, and I forgot what the other property was, but anything that has those details could then be displayed using that exact same component. You would just then take a different smart component and wrap it around it. So you kind of have this idea with intentionally making directives like this, but it goes back to the old adage of, oh, I'll refactor it later to be reusable. If you're starting here, you already get this ability for free. You can already say, this is already a reusable thing. I don't have to do anything else with it. All right, so some downsides. Lots of files, lots of extra components, lots of extra boilerplate because you have extra components. It's difficult to refactor the file structure because you've got more files to handle and to carry the name around with. However, if you're working at scale, working at enterprise, again, all of our angle on how to write this is from the, of course we're writing enterprise. And so that's where what's driving this is that I'm at scale, I've got a lot of people working on it, and it's going to be a big thing. And so the amount of times I touch and change files over the course of the project's lifetime is actually relatively small compared to how many times I'm going to be thinking about how has my data changed, what do I need to do to get it into my template again. So that's a fair trade-off in my opinion. All right, so when should you use Smart and View components? Maybe there's reasons to use just the classic pattern. So I like to preface this by saying I really like to take patterns and go all in and buy in completely and use them everywhere because I want to know where the edge of the cliff is. I want to fall off that cliff and say, I don't want to do that again, and then take a step back and then know the boundary. I really enjoy doing that. And that's what I did with this pattern. Once I've learned it, I'm saying we're going there all the time, and John has been glaring at me for having done so. But it's one of the things where I'm not really finding the edge yet. Once I've gotten used to doing it up front, the only time I've said, you know what, this isn't buying me anything, is when you have purely layout-based components. An example of this would be your app component, the main starting point. Theoretically, its only purpose should be to then put other components on the screen. It shouldn't be sourcing data and throwing them in there. It should be just laying out your first screen for you. There are other cases when you have a particular route. There's a component for that route that lays out how that route looks. Those kinds of components, I've not found any value in doing this. So when else should you use it? Early is an answer there. If you do this right away, you're going to save yourself time in the future if you're building a large project. Likewise, late. We've had a project where this pattern emerged and evolved as we worked on the project, went back and refactored those old components, discovered blatant bugs as a result of where we thought we were passing data, we thought we were putting data in that should have been there, and it wasn't. When your inputs are clearly listed, these kind of things come to the surface. Of course, I've been saying big things, enterprise things, and it's especially nice when you're using a Redux-like data architecture, NGRX being an example of that. Let's see, so when should you avoid it? We already covered that. That was the idea of when you have just a layout-based component that doesn't have any data to pass across the boundary. All right, that's all I got. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
So after Kyle's last talk on state management, we started using a GRX store in our application. So thank you very much. But one of the things that I did, going back to your question earlier, if you're not doing one of these two, what are you doing? What I find myself doing a lot is if I have my component structure, if I need it in this component, I'll put the observable in this component to feed it in,
right,
even if this component otherwise doesn't care about it at all. So I'll be doing the store.select here to pass it in. So I'm looking at this and thinking about so many places that, okay, I would just have the two-level component so
Right.
that this wouldn't need to know about it. I can see that being
Yeah, that was a natural evolution of this, is that was kind of where we landed prior to going the rest of the way there. And we discovered, like, I really don't like having to deal with this observable in something that otherwise doesn't care. And
But then I can go another way. What if this and this and this all need the same thing out of the store? Have you gone to the point where each component always gets it by itself separately, or each smart component gets it? Or do you say, well, all three of these need it, so I just get it
Right.
once and pass it down?
we actually started there as well. And then after a while, it just got to be too kludgy.
Which way?
Passing the same piece of data down through those layers, because that means if one of those needs if one of those really justifies a SmartView component along the way, that's one more layer of data binding. And at that point, you're kind of like, well, why am I using NGRX store if I'm just doing a bucket brigade anyway? And so we ended up going all the way there of saying, yep, if anytime I new component the view component right then, and everything is paired in.
So the only things that are inputted to these smart components are things that are specific to that situation and not like general purpose storage.
We don't input currently. We've not found a reason or to input into the smart component at all. You drop it in, and it also helps with the declarative language aspect of Angular and being able to say, here I have a my list display and no data binding into that. It helps keep that clean and clear for the designers as well. They don't have to see that clutter in the template of me passing it through into a smart component that doesn't need it for its view. So it just kind of, again, keeps that separation concerns very high. So, and yeah, again, it's about your size, your team, how often you touch the files. But I got tired of dealing with that particular boundary and said, nope, smart views everywhere.
And then one other question, stop dominating. How about testing? So we don't do a whole lot of component tests. We do a lot more unit tests because just component tests tend to be annoying. But does this help or hurt?
It helps a lot.
Wow.
Because if we go back to some code here, very specifically I want to look at my SmartView code that is right here. So not here, sorry, this would be the employee list maybe. What would you like to test in my smart component? Okay, let's try it this way then. What would you like to test in my view component? That Angular works? And I'm not being derisive, but it's like, this is a common challenge of pushback that we actually hear from students about, like, I really, really want to test my components. And we go, you really don't. Because if your separation of concerns is at the right layer, there's no logic in these components at all. They're in the services that source the data to the component. Mm-hmm.
So early on in Angular 2, they made a big deal about this ability to do component tests.
Yeah.
Everyone was like, woo! And then, so yeah, lately my opinion has been like, wait, why the hell do we want to do that? So are you agreeing with that?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, and furthermore, you can even go another step with that and say, hey, here I've got like some logic that is needed to like maybe combine multiple sources of data from a service. Well, you can do that here. There's nothing wrong with that. But make it a standalone function that you export. Import that into any testing framework at all, and you've got a standalone function that's testable, separate from your concern about the fact that your component is utilizing it.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, we're on to that. So after Kyle's talk, we're doing our thing with the jury. We'll do that for your right stuff.
Sorry.
No,
It's better.
I won't talk
it is
anymore.
better. So I have a service, with a bunch of effects in it, and then I'm injecting the store and the actions are rolling. Like, I don't want to figure out how to test that. So then I just took everything inside of each map function. I just took it out and put it into another class called util, and then I just write vanilla unit tests against that.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
So myth on my story. So testing components is hard. Let's not do that. Split them apart to two simpler components. Now the view component, I mean, literally, if you're testing that, you're testing Angular. And if you work at Google, you should be getting paid to test Angular. And if you don't, Angular should work, or you should go go use React instead, right? Angular works. Angular is great.
Hey, he said it, not me. I didn't use the R word.
In your smart component, if you start to accumulate much logic, like you were saying, I would move that onto a function. I actually permute a different direction, and we've kind of jointly gone to, well, really, if that does much of anything, we're going to move that into a service, right? You can test the service.
But I could understand the
that's
situation.
Where you go. I go one step further. I can say, if I'm like, why am I writing complex code in a file full of Angularisms where I have to go pick up a bunch of Angularisms to test it? I'll actually take those functions and just put them in a TypeScript file that doesn't have any Angular connections, and I'll test that. And,
I do the same, but I usually put them in the same file as the service.
Right. One tip, though. Go look up the let operator in RxJS. Let is your best friend. Let is an amazing... I could do a whole talk on a let operator, not this week.
So when you do that and just take them to put them in TypeScript, can you spy on those? Because my understanding of a spy on is I'm spying on this function on an object.
But you can use an arbitrary library for doing spying with JavaScript and TypeScript.
Yeah.
You don't need Angular.
And I think it depends on how you export the function.
That too.
Right.
Like, yeah, I would usually do a map and then call the function on the data I've pulled out of the map.
So, I mean, if I have to just export an arbitrary object, it's fine.
Any other questions?
I got a simple one.
Uh-oh.
What's your take on file organization with Smart and View Components? Because I've got an application where I have this flat list of folders, and there's Smart Components and there's View Components, and they're all mixed together. And
Yeah. So the more I use it, the more I'm actually, and it kind of pains me to say it, the more I start to agree with the CLI on terms of their approach to it all. They prefer that you have it in a folder, and so I would have had a employee list folder that has the employee list Smart and View component in there. And what really starts to stink is if you use the CLI to generate this, unless you specify not to, it also creates 2 CSS files as well. So, yeah, but it all is contained within a feature level folder for that component, pair as a group. I'm open to suggestions on that one, though. Not.
that's why I asked.
Yeah, I was surprised to see you're not using the CLI naming convention of employee dash
Yeah,
detail.component.ts.
Yeah, we're not thrilled with the verbosity of that. Like if we're writing up something short and sweet, we'll use the CLI to spit it out. But generally speaking, it's an employee list. Of course, they're components.
You might have this when I stepped out for a minute, but I remember we were talking about this a few weeks ago, about how nice it would be if there was a more concise syntax with a smart component. Sort of like how React has higher order components.
Yeah.
We really would love it if Angular 5 had something like that, a more concise syntax for the smart components.
So that's a perfect segue into the second half of our talk. You want to
Second
talk
half,
version?
we're done.
You want to talk version numbers while I find food?
Version numbers?
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap up. Let's talk about version numbers in the post because we're at 12 minutes.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have one question.
Sure.
So you were talking about this excellent talk last time about state, and we didn't see it. Does that happen to be on YouTube too, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, when did you do that one?
2 months ago.
November.
Go to our YouTube channel. When we publish this on YouTube, put a link on there.
There you go. All right. Anything else? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.